Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and we are officially back. This is our first off-season video, our first one back from the 2024 World Championships. I took a little bit of time off. If you want to know more on that, you can check out the video that I posted a couple of days ago, my channel update video. I want to start this off very quickly by saying thank you to everybody who replied in the comment section of that. I'm taking everybody's feedback into consideration when it comes to that. Obviously, I just want to make content that is good for the channel, but today we are going to be ignoring all of that, all of the, future upcoming 2025 formats and such. We are going to be talking about the offseason for the LEC, our first region that we are going to be covering here. The LEC definitely got done the fastest. This has honestly already been done for basically a month. Like, it was crazy how quick the LEC offseason went. We were really just waiting on one final team to solidify their roster, but here we are. We are done. We know all 10 teams, and we're going to be going over it here today. If you are new to the format, basically what we're going to do is go through all 10 teams here in the LEC. We're going to talk about the changes that they made in the offseason, and I'll kind of be talking about whether or not I think they're moving in the right or the wrong direction. This is not a power rankings video. This is not a projections video for 2025. I will be making a power rankings and projections video a lot closer to the start of the actual split as we get closer to January, but for now, this is an off-season assessment video. I can talk about a team moving in the right direction, even if I don't think they're going to be particularly good in 2025, and I can talk about a team moving in the wrong direction and making passive, safe moves, even if I think they might be a top 5 team in 2025. Those things are not necessarily, interconnected, and so I always want to specify that at the start of the video, but again, most of this is going to be talking about whether or not I think these orgs are making good, fair, balanced decisions that are good for the long-term health of the org and the club and, the team and the players and all of that. Spoiler alert, really good offseason for the LEC, and I'm probably going to say that globally. Most teams just got straight up better this offseason. I think that there was a lot of turmoil at the end of 2024, and it really does feel like a lot of teams are doing better this offseason than they did last year, which is really good to see. I think they're making smarter decisions. So I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. There is still some preamble to go over, so without further ado, let's get into it. Up on your screen now is going to be the key, the legend, whatever you want to call it, to talk about my grading scale. I will be giving a grade to every single player in this video. This grade, first of all, is not going to be a grade of how good they are right now, or at least it's not solely how good they are right now. This is a grade in terms of value. That's the way I always like to phrase it. Value is kind of a very wide term. It's a large net, and so I'll try to simplify it a bit here. I think value indicates just how valuable you are to have that player if you are the team. Having one A-plus player is going to instantly raise the value of your team, and that A-plus player is going to be valued as likely the highest commodity in the league. You can be a player that's worse than another player and still be valued higher if I think you have upside, or if you aren't an import. Import status is going to knock down some of the value of these players, and so, that kind of thing. If there are a lot of ways to determine value. The specifics I'll talk about with each player, and so there isn't an end-all be-all in terms of these grades, but this is going to be the general key and the general scale. Another thing that I always have to point out at the beginning of these videos, because I always get new viewers with these videos, and if you're new, welcome. I hope you enjoy the content, but a lot of things that I get from new commenters are, I can't believe you rated player an A- instead of an A, or I can't believe you gave someone a B instead of a B+, that kind of thinking. If you're 1 or 2 grades off from where I'm at, we're probably very similar. This is a very flexible grading scale. I think that there is a lot of movement that can happen. I think generally speaking, a player can move up or down 1 or 2 grades in the span of 10 games. I think that that's pretty believable. It's all really just about form. And so if I give a player an A- and you think they should be an A, or if I give a player a B- and you think they should be a B or even a B+, or even a C if you think they're a lot worse than what I'm considering, you're not that far off from my opinion. I'm certainly not trying to say this is the end-all be-all of grades, but this is kind of the explanation for each of those grades. If you're in the A's at all, you are one of the best players in the region. You are going to be a top 5 player. You're going to be an MVP candidate. I don't give a player an A grade, an A- or above grade if I don't think that they are somebody who can actively win the MVP award in the LEC, but again, there are definitely some differences. There's only one A+ player. You probably already know who it is, but this is the best in the region. I'm not saying there can only be one A+ plus, but there is only one A plus in the LEC right now. This is the clear-cut best player in the region. This is a player that no matter who the surrounding core is, no matter who else is playing with them, they are going to make them a title contender and they are going to make them a world's threat. Like, that's how good an A plus player is, especially in a Western region. And so, you know, you feel good about that. Obviously, there's not a lot of competition there. A generally would be your superstars. These are borderline top 1, top 2 players. They are going to be top 1 or top 2 at any given time in terms of, you know, throughout the year, but I will say no A-graded players in the LEC, so don't worry about this too much. You're either an A+ or you're an A- because the inconsistency comes in at A-. This is still an elite grade. This is, to me, somebody that is easily like top 5 in terms of their ranking in the league amongst all players and is likely top 1 or top 2 in their individual position, but maybe has some more inconsistencies than an A-graded player will. I have some worries that in the wrong situation, they could drop down to being a B+ or a B, but for the most part are just going to be elite level players and have shown themselves to be MVP favorites throughout multiple splits in the past. But if you're an A grade at any point, you are an elite player. I don't want anyone to take an A- grade as some sort of disrespect. That's certainly not how it's intended. In terms of this grading scale, I'm pretty harsh in that regard. Once you start getting into the Bs, these are still really good starters, players that I think teams are very happy trotting out as one of their starting 5, but maybe aren't like the game breakers that A's are. B+ is just going to be your consistently good starters, and B is just going to be your inconsistently good starters. These are very similar players. B+ and B is where a lot of players end up congregating in terms of these rankings, especially players that are kind of, you know, top region staples. B- and C+ are obviously very, you know, packed as well, but your longtime starters and players that have very much confirmed their spots as starting players, but maybe aren't like MVP favorites, they're going to fall into this B+ B range. Really, the only difference for me is going to be the consistency of how often you're getting there. There are a lot of situations where B players are going to be better than B+ players, or are going to play better than B+ players for specific stretches of time. They're just not going to do it nearly as consistently, or I have some questions about them that aren't there for the B+ players. Maybe the upside of a B+ player might not be as high, but you know what you're going to get from them on a game-to-game basis. That's really the only difference to me between B+ and B. And as you get into B-, this is still a good starter. This is still someone you feel very fine, you know, trotting out. You can make worlds with the B- starter, but you're not feeling as great about it. You want them to be probably one of the weaker starters on your team, if not your weakest starter on the team, if they are going to be a B- caliber player. Again, still somebody that deserves an LEC spot and has proven that they deserve to be starting in the league, but maybe not someone that is like, you know, a top 4 player in their role, like someone who's going to be closer to the middle of the pack. And then once you start getting into the Cs, these are players with question marks. C+ is going to be a weak starter is the way I classify it here. This is somebody that probably should be starting in the LEC, has shown enough either upside or, you know, a floor to have a starting spot, but isn't necessarily someone I'm super excited about, and someone that I think the org would likely be looking to upgrade in the future if they could. If you get to the C, you're looking at players that have like real questionable qualities, either are very questionable prospects that haven't necessarily shown that they're LEC caliber in my eyes yet, or players that have played at the LEC level and just not been very good. That's what C is going to be reserved for. And if you ever hit C- or below, you know, God forbid, like that's a player that I can't vouch for being in the LEC. There are no C- in terms of players that are actively starting still, but if there were, it would be players that there just is no conversation to be had. I'm shocked that they have a job in the LEC after how they have played, or, you know, generally how they're perceived. Now, this rating, this key, I guess, does adjust a bit for rookies. The rookie scale really only ever goes from C to B. You're not going to see a player who wasn't playing in the LEC last split get a B+, because it's just really hard to project that, but especially if they've never played in the LEC before, it's going to be really hard for me to give them a grade above B, and generally B is where I cap out on players that I've yet to see play an LEC game. That's more so just a precautionary thing. I just don't want to anoint a rookie to be the greatest thing of all time. There are circumstances in which I believe players will live up to those expectations and be closer to a B+ year one. I'll talk about those in specific, but typically the rating scale is if I give a rookie a B, like they're the top prospect and they're somebody that should be starting in the LEC for a top tier team from day one. B- is a really good player and somebody that I think will be a contributing player in the LEC basically from day one. The C+ and C, like C+ is like, yeah, I feel good about this call up, you know, I'm not going to freak out just yet. They're a good, you know, ERL player or wherever they ended up playing, you know, an LCK Challengers League player, whatever, right? They're a good player, but maybe not one that I'm sold is going to be top 4 or 5 in their role day one. And then if I give give C to a rookie that's like, you've got a lot to prove to me. I gave that to Jackie's last year, and obviously he proved it, but it doesn't always work out like that. There are players that come from definitely more meager starts and definitely are maybe over-promoted a little bit too fast. I think you can look at someone like Dior for a long time on Astralis as an example of that, but that's the scale. I know I go way too much in depth on that at the start of this video, but it's really important to establish the criteria because I get so many comments every single time I make these videos about how crazy it is that I rank a player in a certain grade and, you know, your words don't match it. Here's the scale, and if you want to complain about it, this is the scale that I would like to go off of. But that's just the intro. It's time to actually get into the analysis of the video. I know it feels like it takes forever, 10 full minutes to get into the actual analysis, but these videos are meant to be long. I know you guys like the podcast style format as you responded in the comment section. So without further ado, let's get into it. The way we order and structure these kinds of videos is different from the power rankings. Typically in the power rankings, I'll go from my personal number 10 to my personal number 1. Here, I'm just going to go in order for how they finished in the summer split, or I guess in terms of championship points last year with the teams that were in the season finals first, and we're actually going to go in descending order. So we're going to start with the champions, the back-to-back LEC champions here, and that is G2 Esports. You can see up on the screen now what the graphic is going to look like. On the top side of your screen, you're going to see the team from 2024. On the bottom side, the team for 2025. There are a lot of things on the screen, so we'll quickly go over it. First of all, obviously, how they finished in the summer split is going to be located in the top right corner. Of course, G2 getting first place. Every single player will have a grade next to their name. I've already specified what those grades entail, and I'll kind of specify individual players at times that I think are important to talk about. And then in the middle, you're going to see a variety of things. No change obviously indicates that the team is not making a change at that position, and so there's no real reason to talk about whether or not they improved or downgraded. Change in yellow, as you see here for G2, is going to indicate that they are obviously making a change, but it's more neutral in my eyes, or you're getting worse in the short term or getting more unstable in the short term to potentially get better in the long term. We'll talk about that, you know, in the individual circumstances. That's obviously the most context dependent. And then upgrade or downgrade, if that's going to be your cut and dry circumstances. If you see upgrade for a player, that means I just think they got better at that position. The team just got better going into this year. If you see downgrade, I think the team just got worse at that position. And obviously there still is context in those, and we'll talk about it. But for the most part, this is meant to be kind of an easy to read system. Let me know if you guys like this down in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and get into the specifics for G2. Their lineup obviously this year in 2025 is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Skewmond in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Labrav at support. You're retaining your two most important players for sure, or at least what I would argue are your two most important players in Broken Blade and Caps. The solo laners were integral to the success of G2, especially down the stretch of the year. Something we're going to say a lot is that LEC teams just by and large got worse in the summer split than they were in winter and spring, at least in terms of consistency. You saw a lot of players really underperforming. It's something we're going to talk about a lot throughout the video. That was kind of the case for some of these players. Caps in particular, I think, played his worst in the season finals going into the World Championships. And so, you know, there's obviously some concern there, but it's Caps. And I mean, for the most part, he was one of the best players in the world throughout all of last year. He is the only LEC player who's going to be receiving an A+ grade, and I don't really think there should be any sort of argument on that. If there's any argument, it's that maybe Caps is an A-graded player and that there is no A+ grade, but in terms of value, like, would any team turn down Caps for anything? Like, I mean, having him is such a huge advantage that no other team can actually equal. Caps is just that kind of an X-factor difference maker type of player, and so I don't have to talk about him too much. You obviously retain Broken Blade in the top lane. I've criticized Broken Blade in the past, but I've really come around on him since he's joined G2. I think he's gotten way better at playing weak side, and he's the best top laner in the LEC, at least as of right now. You're also keeping Hansama. This one's a little bit more questionable, especially because you're bringing Labrav in to play support. And I want to make it clear, I really like Labrav. I think he's a very good player. Hans has had his ups and downs. I think he was actually pretty good down the stretch. He was one of the few LEC players, I think, that got better throughout the year and got a little bit more consistent. You know, there's been some, you know, questions and concerns about his international performances in the past. I think a lot of those are well-founded. He's not played particularly well internationally, but you don't really have a ton of great options in the LEC. The problem with the LEC is that a lot of the AD carries are around this level where you feel like they're good, but maybe not great. And I feel like Hansama kind of fits that role. I feel fine with them bringing him back. I think that if you were able to get someone like Berserker, if he was ever on the table, maybe you consider that, but there aren't really a lot of upgrades in those roles. And so Hans, staying here, I think is totally fine. The reason I say that I'm a bit concerned about it, or at least confused, is I'm not really sure about his fit with Labrov individually. I think they're kind of opposite players in terms of their play styles. Now, as you can see, I actually think Labrov is really good, and anybody who's followed the channel over the past year or 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever I've been talking about him would know that I think Labrov is incredibly underrated by the community. He finished 3rd in my MVP voting for all of last year, and to me, he was very clearly the best support in the LEC. I have him with a higher grade than Mickey X purely because Mickey's coming off of such a bad year, in my opinion, at least in comparison to his own standards, and Labrov was better, but this is going to be considered a change, not only because I think the playstyle fit between him and Hansama is a little bit more questionable than the playstyle fit between him and Mickey, or Hans and Mickey, but also because, Mickey X is Mickey X. It's really hard to say that you're ever upgrading from Mickey X, who's one of, if not the best support in European League of Legends history, who just, 2 years ago was the best player in the LEC in 2023, was clearly the MVP. Like, Labrov was better last year, but can you really expect him to be better for this team moving forward? It's really hard to say that. That being said, again, I don't want to say anything bad about Labrov. He's a super active player in the mid game. I think he's one of the smartest players in the LEC, certainly one of the most consistent in terms of his strengths and minimizing his weaknesses, something that a lot of LEC supports just don't do, like Mickey X and like Hillisang. A lot of these supports that are really aggressive but will also give over a lot of bad plays. Labrov isn't really like that. He's going to be a lot more consistent on a game-to-game basis. The thing I will say, fit-wise that I keep talking about is that Hansama is very much an early game AD carry player. He loves his Kalista, he loves his Draven, he loves to play strong side, and he loves to play 4 lane, and Labrov is just not that kind of player. He is arguably the best team fighter, like full stop, in the entire region. He certainly has a conversation to be up there, at top 1 or top 2. But he's really never been this huge lane threat. At least we haven't seen that out of him in the BDS revival at all. They've been really, really passive in terms of how they played their bot lane. Him and Ice last year were very much a team fight focused, team fight oriented, scaling oriented bot lane, type of team. And so it'll be interesting to see if those styles end up clashing or meshing together really well. Perhaps we could see a situation where Hans is so good in the laning phase that he can kind of hide the fact that Labrov is, just kind of average in the laning phase. And then once you get to the team fights, Labrov is taking over the game and setting up for Broken Blade and Caps, who are playing more strong side. I think that that's very believable. That's definitely an outcome that I could see being very possible. But there is reason to be at least a little bit concerned when it comes to the fit as in comparison to Mickey X, who's going to play that more aggressive style in the early and in the mid game alongside Hansama. That being said, I love Labrov. He's the only support who's in the A range in terms of grades. I do think he is the best support in the LEC, the most valuable support in the LEC, and clearly G2 agreed. They chose Labrov over Mickey X when they wanted to make a change. And so, I'm going to trust that my grade is correct, and I'm going to trust that G2's grade is correct when they go into this offseason. But really the big change is going to be going from Yike to Skewmond in the jungle. This is obviously the big move that a lot of people are going to be talking about. Mickey to Labrov, it's like, okay, you have your pick of whichever support you want, and you went with Labrov, that's fine. But Skewmond, having never played a game at the LEC level, like they're doing Yike, but again, and I think there's reason to believe that it could theoretically go better this time, but I'm not as in love with this change as I think a lot of other people are going to be. I'm a big fan of Yike. I think he's one of the best players in the LEC, and I think he has gotten consistently better, split over split over split. Yes, he had some struggles down the stretch in the season finals and at the end of the summer split, even at the World Championships, and they've been well documented. Again, very similar to what we talked about with Hansama, but, everybody in the LEC kind of got worse. Even Caps got worse going into the back half of the year, and so I don't really want to hold that against him too much. When he was a top 2 or top 3 player in winter and in spring of last year, he was an MVP, favorite for a lot of this year for me until that summer split. It's just really hard to feel like it's the right move to move on from someone like that who feels like he was finally starting to develop some good chemistry with the rest of the team. You're moving from him to a really unproven commodity in Skewmond, and I want to make it clear, I think Skewmond is a great prospect. I'm maybe not quite as high on him as everybody else, if only because I think there were 2 phenomenal jungle prospects coming out of the ERA ERLs and coming out of the LFL this past year, but Skumond is arguably the best, jungle prospect we've seen in a long time, including Yike, and so, there is a lot of hype surrounding him, and I think there is reason behind making this change. It's just going to be interesting to see if they can unlock more of that secondary carry playstyle from Skumon than they ever were able to unlock in Yike. A lot of people criticized Yike when he came to the LEC because he wasn't great at tanks, he wasn't great at facilitators, and it forced Caps to be a little bit more passive in terms of how he played out the early game. That's not Skumond. Skumond is a very versatile player. You're going to see a lot of Maokai. You're going to see a lot of Volley Bear from him, but he can carry. We saw a lot of those AP scaling carries, things like Zyra and Brand. If there is a criticism from me in terms of his playstyle and why I'm not sure he's like a perfect player just yet, he is a little bit scaling focused. He's not quite as active early game as a lot of the other junglers we've seen come up through the ERLs. That does give him an air of consistency that a lot of other junglers just didn't have. It's the reason he was able to dominate the LFL so much, is because he was so consistent at being able to win mid-game fights, secure objectives, and, scale his team into the late game to pick up wins, but he's not like this crazy playmaker in the same way that you would get out of like Isma coming up last year. Not that Isma was, as good of a prospect. We'll talk about 113 a bit later, who I think is his big competition in terms of big jungle prospects this year, but Skumond was, the more consistent for sure of the two of them, and I think that's kind of what G2 is going towards. I think they're worried that Yike is just not going to bring that consistency regardless of what his upside looks like, and if Skumond is just going to be someone that can come in, be that plug-and-play jungle, can play a carry, an AP carry coming out of the jungle spot, or can play a tank, can play those Maokais or those Volley Bears or those Sejuanis or whatever they want them to play, I think he just gives them a little bit of flexibility, and so that's kind of what I assume the thinking is behind the change. But overall, off-season wise, do I think G2 got better? It's hard to say they got better, right? It's hard to say that the team that has won back-to-back-to-back-to-back, titles, 5 of the last 6, it's hard to say that they could get better with any change, but I think LeBron was better than Mickey X last year, and I think there's reason to believe he will be this year now that he's on G2, and Skumond is, again, one of the best jungle prospects we've seen in a while, even if I don't know if he's going to be as good as Yike this year, and so, they're going to be favorites no matter what. When you have Caps, when you have Broken Blade, you're bringing in the top tier prospects. This is still the king organization of Europe, and they had their pick of the litter, and this is what they decided to go with. I'm going to trust the org that they know what they're doing, and I'm going to say that they're probably going to be favorites to win yet again. Then moving on to second place from last split, and of course, it's been kind of the perennial second place. Sorry, Fnatic fans, it's Fnatic, and I do think that their changes this offseason bring them into an interesting kind of new zone where instead of being a team that has a ton of question marks and could finish as high as first and as low as like 6th or 7th in terms of the inconsistency that they bring, now they're a team that is way more consistent in my eyes, a team that has a much higher floor, but I'm honestly a little bit more concerned about like the theoretical upside of this team, even if I don't think the letter grades changed at all going into 2025, which we'll go ahead and talk about. Their lineup in 2025 is looking like Oscarinin in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. You're obviously staying the same on the top side of the map. Razork and Huma kind of feel like the core of this team at this point, and so it's hard to kind of move in a different direction from that. Razork moves up to an A- after being a B for basically his entire tenure on this channel. He had the best year of his entire career, in my opinion, last year, and I think he really solidified himself as arguably the best jungler in the LEC. Certainly was last year, but projection-wise, it's definitely going to be interesting moving into 2025. I feel good about Razork. The consistency finally came around, and Humanoid, to his credit, had some really good moments in the regular season last year, something that we haven't really said a lot of throughout his career, but the problem with Humanoid very much continued, which is he'll pick, 2 splits of the year to be really good and 1 split to be really bad, and that includes the international tournaments at the time, and unfortunately, unlike previous years, instead of him being bad in winter and spring and at the beginning of the year and kind of figuring things out when things get important in the playoffs, he was really bad in the playoffs. He was really bad in the season finals, and he wasn't very good at Worlds either, and so, that's a bit of a concern. Is just, that for 3 months of the year, Humanoid's going to be a horrible mid laner. Like, you just kind of have to live with that if you're Fnatic, because you get such a good player the other 6 months of the year, but, he's going to get a B+. I know I said consistency was kind of the thing separating B+ and B, but Humanoid is so good when he's so good that I can't give him a B. Like, it just feels disrespectful. That being said, the inconsistency means I just can't give him an A. Like, he's not an A-graded player in terms of the value that he brings to the team. I've gone over this many years in the past, but basically settled into that on Humanoid. And then you're also retaining Oscar Rinnan. He was actually the first big re-signing of the offseason. I don't feel great about Oscar. I've continued to be a lot lower on him than I think other people are. He's fine. He's very inconsistent, but he's going to have some really great games. I'm just not sold on him being the kind of top laner you want if you're trying to be the best team in the LEC. I think you can do better than Oscar Rinnan. I think a lot of other teams have done better than Oscar Rinnan. But if you want kind of a middle tier top laner, I think Oscar's going to fit really well into that mold. Again, very inconsistent. There are going to be some games where he looks phenomenal and incredible and, can really play not only on weak side, but on strong side and can carry games in late team fights if he's on champions that he's comfortable on. There are also going to be games where he just gets mega abused 1v1 in lane. Like, there aren't a lot of top laners that are super consistent at the LEC level, but Oscar takes that to like the next level because his losses are arguably the worst in the entire region. When he loses super hard. But again, most games he's fine. That's why he's getting a B. I don't think he's a negative player. You're fine starting him, and you can very easily make finals with someone like Oscar Rinnan in the top lane. Hell, he could have a really good playoff run like he did last year and really be a contributing factor to your team winning. You just can't really rely on being able to get that every single game or at any given time, and that's kind of my concern with him, and that kind of bleeds into the rest of this. Razork has been inconsistent throughout his career, really with the exception of last year. Humanoid is obviously super inconsistent. Oscar is super inconsistent, and now you're bringing in some very inconsistent players to replace more consistent players in the bot lane, and while I think you have a higher upside now in terms of like the mechanical ceiling that you could reach, like you're bringing in Mickey X, who's coming off of a bad year, and maybe you can talk about the even year versus odd year thing when it comes to Mickey X. He's really good in odd years. He's not very good in even years. You go back to 2022 on Excel and he was awful. You go to 2023, he's great. Last year, he was kind of really dragging G2 down for a lot of the year until he figured his shit out. Like, he's just an inconsistent player because of the risks he's willing to take. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're bad, but, it doesn't increase the consistency of a team that's already lacking in that department, and especially going from someone like Jun, who I actually think got way better throughout the year. Last year, he ends as a B+ graded player. He's like an A- grade in terms of his actual performances, but he's a B+ in terms of value because, again, of that import tag. I do think that he's, he was better last year than Mickey X was. It's hard to say that he's going to be better moving into 2025. It's why they have the same grade. And again, I feel really confident in Mickey X, and I don't want it to seem like I'm some sort of Mickey X hater. I just can't completely forget what happened in 2024, which was just not particularly good from my perspective. So this is going to be listed as a change because, again, I think Jun was better last year. I think Mickey is probably going to be better this year. That would be my projection. And then you're going from Noah to Upset. I think this is a side grade in terms of basically what you're getting. I think they're very similar players. Upset at times has been pretty elo stuck the past couple of years. I know people make jokes about him constantly being on 10th place teams, and obviously I doubt that will happen this year on Fnatic. They're just way too talented to even be in that conversation. We've said that about other teams that he's been on in the past, but it's certainly something that I would be more surprised here on Fnatic. But Upset's not a star anymore. I think when he was last on Fnatic, he was. I was really vouching for him as the #1 AD carry in the league when he was last on Fnatic, but it's just not really the case right now. I think a lot of the tendencies that he has gotten stuck into on these bad teams have really stuck on him. And I think when you're looking at players that I would compare him to, I think he plays a lot more similarly to players like Patrick or these more passive AD carries nowadays. I call it kind of the Teddy archetype over in the LCK, that archetype where you're a good player, you have a ton of mechanics, and you can clearly execute if the rest of the team is going well, but you just don't really have that killer instinct to be the best player on the team. If you're being asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the roster, then you're just not in the right spot for you. I think that's kind of where Upset has landed for me, which is why he's getting a B grade here. That being said, if he just turns into a really productive player for this team because Razork and Huma are creating so much in the middle of the map and Mickey is so aggressive in the support position, I wouldn't be shocked to see Upset be like a top 2 or top 3 AD carry in terms of performance. Again, AD carry in the LEC is always so wide open. I think a lot of these players are just so close in terms of skill level, and Upset very much fits into that category. And so replacing this bot lane I think is certainly interesting. You've basically brought on 4 veterans and then Oscar Rinnan. Oscar's getting very close to that veteran status, but I think this team is going to be fine. I don't really love the direction that they're moving in. I would have loved to see some sort of youth or some more concrete direction. Like you're getting rid of some of your, actual young, I guess, unproven players in Noah and Jun to move to like the most established players that you could have gotten in free agency in Upset and Mickey X, which is certainly not the direction I would have gone in. But, this team will be fine. I'm not like super stoked about their offseason. I think they could have done, some more interesting things, but this will be a competitive team once again, and they will likely be a Worlds team once again. Then moving on now to number 3 from last year, our third and final Worlds team from 2024. They are going through a name change, so it's a bit different, but now it is just officially Koi. No longer Mad Lions Koi. We got rid of the Mad Lions part. Koi is reportedly going to be the full team name, I guess, for them moving forward here in 2025. I think that that's totally fine, bringing the brand back. Hopefully it goes better for them this year than it did in 2023, but they only made one change, and in my opinion, it's a very good one. I think we're looking at a team that's going to be underrated by a lot of people going into this year because they weren't expected to be as good as they were last year. I think people are going to look at some regression, but I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that this is still going to be a team that's a favorite to get to Worlds once again and to be one of the best teams in Europe. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, their lineup is looking like Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Jojo Pune in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. This is obviously a really intriguing offseason for them. They're retaining their core. I felt pretty, comfortable in saying that this was obvious. I don't think a lot of people were expecting them to make a lot of changes after overperforming so much last year. They were the team to come up and say, screw it, we're going to invest into our future. We're going to bring in basically an entire ERL team and just see how it goes, basically give them a promotion slot. And you know what? It absolutely worked out for them. Making Worlds in year 1 is incredible. There were some ups and downs, obviously, throughout a lot of the back half of the regular seasons, and in the domestic play, they weren't exactly great, but they got the job done. They were able to beat G2 in a best of 5, and that got them to the World Championships, where they played fine. I think people are going to criticize their actual Swiss stage performance, but they were phenomenal in the play-in stage, and they had a hard draw in the Swiss stage. I'm not going to criticize them too much. I think they played up to expectation, but there's a lot to like about the people that are retaining. I think obviously retaining the bot lane was critical, essential, the number one priority for this team. Supa and Alvaro are the stars of this team, regardless, I think, of what a lot of people want to talk about. If you followed this channel for more than, a month, you'll know that I'm super high on Supa and Alvaro, that I think they are one of the best bot lanes in Europe already. I think they performed like that for basically all of last year. I've been a gigantic Supa defender. Go follow me on Twitter if you don't believe that. And Alvaro is, I think, someone that has a lot less contention surrounding whether or not he's good. I think Supa sometimes gets memed on because of the things he said about Deft and being the best AD carry in Europe, but honestly, for a lot of last year, he was in the conversation for being the best AD carry in Europe, in my opinion, in terms of the performance and the production that he was putting out. I think Alvaro is obviously also a budding star in the support position. I think when you're looking at players that are going to be in the conversation for being the best support in Europe over the next couple of years, Alvaro is very much going to be in that conversation, as is Supa in terms of, how the best AD carry conversation in Europe is going to look. If they were the best bot lane in EU this year, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. Now, I'm not saying that's guaranteed or anything. There were obviously a ton of inconsistent moments, but they had a lot of responsibility last year, especially when the top side of this map was disastrously bad in the summer split when they barely made it into the playoffs. Supa and Alvaro were doing a lot of the hard carrying for that team in the back half of the summer split. I think a lot of that hopefully is going to be taken off of their shoulders this year, and they can perhaps actually play their 2v2 game and win, instead of being the entirety of a team and trying to 2v8 like they were for a lot of the summer split. But for the rest of the team, Elyoya staying totally fine. Elyoya's going to drop to a B+. He's been an A-graded player for me for years. I've constantly considered him the best jungler in the LEC, but he had some real concerning parts last year. Maybe you can talk about some of it being the responsibility and the pressure of him being the team leader and him being kind of the only veteran on the team. When you bring in all of these rookies, perhaps that kind of maybe marred some of his actual gameplay a little bit, but at the end of the day, I can only go off of what I see on the tape, and what was on the tape wasn't phenomenal. There were definitely stretches where he was bad last year. I think he was great in winter when they ended up making finals. He was probably the biggest reason why that ended up happening, obviously alongside Mirwin, who had a great playoff run, and Supa and Alvaro, who I thought were excellent in the winter split, but his summer split was horrendous, truly awful. We're going to criticize a lot of junglers for not necessarily playing well in summer. We already did it with Yike, and we'll talk a bit more about him later, but Elyoya was worse than all of them. For sure. He was actively losing games for this team super regularly out of the jungle position, and there really was no defending how he played. He's going to stay at a B+ because he's been good for so long, and I really do not believe that version of him is real. I think it was very much just situational in terms of how things ended up working out for MDK last year, but I have to take into account at least a little bit. Like, I have to at least process it in my brain that there were definitely some concerning moments. So he falls out of the A range for the first time, I think, basically since he was a rookie, down into the B+ range. This was definitely a little bit of a rough drop for me because I've been parading him around as the #1 jungler for so long, but I just don't think he is anymore. And then you have Mirwin in the top lane, and again, longtime fans of the channel will know how I feel about Mirwin. I'm significantly lower on him as a player. I think it has become very clear that he is just not good at meta top laners. Like, he just can't really play them. That can be fine in certain circumstances, and I know there's going to be another player that I rank pretty highly in the top lane that kind of gets that reputation as well. The difference, in my opinion, is that when Mirwin loses, like, it's just not playable for the rest of the team. He will go 0-7, he will run it down, and obviously if you look at, you know, the good games and the high moments for him, it's going to look fantastic, but as I talked about a lot last year, when you, like, actually average out a lot of his games in terms of, like, the grades and the scores and the, you know, the performance ratings that I give out, he was, like, profoundly negative for MDK last year. It was not even remotely close. Like, he was a huge negative on the top side of the map. I think he could get more consistent. Obviously, the talent is there and the uniqueness is really cool, but I think I am a bit concerned that the more he plays in the LEC, the more he kind of just gets figured out, and that surprise factor doesn't necessarily carry over. We'll see how it ends up working out. If year 2 is better than year 1, I'm gonna, you know, kind of flip the script, but for now, he's an okay starter because you're gonna get some good games out of him. B- is very generous for how he played for a majority of last year, but again, there were stretches where he was just phenomenal, especially in the playoffs, in those best of 5s, where he looked really good. So, you know, I'm not going to completely take it away. He beat G2 in the season finals, and so it's a hard rating to give, but this is where I've landed. And then that leads us to the last player, and the only new addition to this team. You're going from Fresskowy to Jojo Pune, the first ever, you know, North American-born player coming into the LEC, and, you know, being that NA import. I think technically when Santorin was playing, you know, many years ago, he was technically an NA player. He had registered as an NA player, but Jojo, really the first North American-born player to be brought into the LEC, has brought a lot of headlines to this team. This is an upgrade. This is just a straight-up upgrade, regardless of whether or not you think Jojo was better than Fresskowy last year, which I think is certainly an argument. You know, Jojo wasn't very good, but Fresskowy also had his own problems. He got a B- grade from me as well. Jojo's upside is just infinitely higher. His mechanical ceiling is not comparable, in my opinion, to Fresskowy, and I think bringing him in, like I said earlier, takes a lot of the pressure off of players like Supa and Alvaro and even Elyoya to a lesser extent to be kind of the dominant resource gathering threats in the early game, and should open up the map a lot more for Koi. I think Jojo coming over here to the LEC makes a lot of sense for him as well. Obviously struggling a bit last year in North America, but if he really feels like he wants to compete with the best regularly, I think mid lane is a much better position in the LEC than it is in the LCS. Not that it's horrible in the LCS, but it's certainly not nearly as good. And I think this is going to give him arguably a bigger fan base. There's a lot more people who watch European League than North American League, at least at the current moment. And so it makes a lot of sense for Jojo to come over. I think it really opens the door for a lot of other North American players to consider big offers from Europe if those are coming in. And, you know, this had been talked about for a while. Jojo was getting LCK rumors last year, and so it kind of felt like a matter of time before he left North America to go to a bigger league, and this ended up being the destination. But again, this is just an upgrade in terms of upside. Now, there are going to be some situations where I could be concerned about Jojo maybe not fitting perfectly, but we've already seen some of the positives in some of the stage games that Koi has already played, where his playmaking potential and his ability to outplay his opponents is just so much higher than what they were offered last year. I think this is just a better version of what they were. I think keeping the core around is obviously a no-brainer because you brought them in to grow and develop together to be that kind of comfort zone for each other, and, you know, they've played together for many years now, and so keeping 4 of the members of this roster together, your in-game leader, your carries from last year, your big surprise factor on the top side, it all makes sense. But, you know, getting another X factor in the mid lane, this is a fantastic offseason for Koi. And again, I think a lot of people aren't going to rank this as a world's, you know, projected team, a top 3 team in the LEC. I think that might be misguided. This is a team that might be even better than they were last year, and if you can find some semblance of consistency, if Elyoya gets back to his strengths, we could be looking at one of the best teams in the LEC. But now that we are out of the Worlds teams from last year, it's time to finally get into some of the teams that are making big wholesale changes, and that does start with our number 4 team, the team that just barely missed out on Worlds, Team BDS. And some of these changes were obviously decisions they made. Some of these changes were kind of forced upon them. I think that they would have looked to have a couple of different things happen if things were to go perfectly, but for the most part, I think they are looking at a very good offseason, and in my opinion, this team is looking very, very scary going into 2025. 2025. I think a lot of people, again, are going to underestimate them. I feel pretty good about this team, and we'll go ahead and talk about that. Their lineup in 2025 is looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, 113 in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Paris at support. You're keeping your carry duo here. Nuke and Ice are the two that are remaining. In my opinion, probably the best case scenario for you in this instance. You did move on from Labrov, who I thought was the best player on this team last year. People will argue that it's Ice. I think bot lane was the strength of this team last year, but I don't know how much of that was in your control. Even if it was, I don't think you're making that bad of a decision in terms of changing supports. We'll talk about that in a second, but keeping Ice around here, who became the win condition for this team throughout a lot of the back half of the year, is a no-brainer. He has obviously turned into a very good player. I would argue that he is the most consistent AD carry in the region by far. When you're asking me if I could have one ADC to, complement the rest of my team, it's probably Ice, just because you know what you're going to get from him on a game-to-game basis. As much as I love players like Supa or even someone like a Hanzama, you don't really know on a game-to-game basis if they're just going to completely, lose their minds and lose the game. Ice just doesn't play like that. He's a great team fighter. He's a good enough laner to be able to survive. You feel good about keeping him around. And then Nuke in the mid lane has really turned into a pretty solid player. In my opinion, last year was his best year ever. I think he was really good last year for BDS. I don't think he got nearly enough credit for arguably being the best player on this team for at least all of spring, certainly parts of the middle of the year. I think Nuke was really, really valuable, one of the best mid laners in the LEC, and I think he's solidified himself as somebody who can be on a top tier team. I've kind of consistently ranked him as that B-graded mid laner who's you feel okay about having him if you're a team that's trying to get to Worlds, but he's not someone that's going to be pushing you forward there. I feel a lot better about him going into 2025 than I did going into 2024, than I did going into 2023, etc., right? I think he's really established himself as a very good mid laner at this level. Not that he wasn't before, just a very good mid laner, somebody who's going to compete for top 3 in terms of the production in the region, which I think is a big positive. But then you've got a lot of other changes that I'm excited to talk about. Let's start with the first one that they made, which is the support position. This was announced very early on in the offseason that Labrov was going to be out, likely because G2 was just picking him up, but also I don't think this is a bad idea to just promote Paris here. He's going to be coming up from BDS Academy, and anybody, again, who's followed the channel for a small amount of time will know that Paris is somebody that I value very highly. I think this guy is insane. In my opinion, he's the best ERL player. I know Skewmond is going to get a lot more credit, and I think Skewmond was more important towards BDS's success this past split, but I think in terms of projecting into the future, if Paris was the best support in the LEC in a year, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. That's how good I think this guy could be. I've been talking about it for a very long time. It's really just been a matter of time before he's been given a shot in the LEC, and I think this is a fantastic destination for him because I think Ice is such a crucial win condition for the team. Pairing him up with someone like Ice, I think, is going to be huge, and again, if he just comes out and dominates the Rookie of the Year conversation for me, don't be surprised. I really value him incredibly highly. Again, he's going to get that B grade. That's the highest I'll give anybody who's never played in the LEC because I just can't justify saying that he's guaranteed to be, a top 3 player in his role consistently before he's ever played a single game, before I've seen a single bit of tape. But just know that his tape is phenomenal. If you haven't gone and watched a lot of his top tier games, please go and do so. He just does everything well. He is a very well-rounded player. He's a great engaged support player. I think he'll fit very well on this team, and again, I think he's a superstar level prospect and somebody that I really would give almost anything to bring up. Even if you're getting rid of Labrov, I think this really isn't that bad of a change, even if you're getting maybe a little bit worse in terms of the floor of what your team can offer. That's why this isn't a downgrade. This is a change, even though you're losing my highest graded support in the entire league. That's how highly I view Paris. And then the other one that I want to talk about, first is going to be top lane, Relevant coming in for Adam. This to me is going to be considered a change. Most people are going to consider this an upgrade. I think a lot of people, again, who follow the channel know I'm higher on Adam and lower on Irrelevant than maybe everybody else. I think they're very comparable players. In fact, I think they're very similar in a lot of ways. I think this is a pretty clean transition, and especially if Adam's going to be causing any sort of trouble out of game, obviously it sounds like all of that has been, at least behind him for a little bit, but there's always that dark cloud hanging over Adam. If that's going to be any sort of issue, bringing in someone like Irrelevant maintains that playstyle, that very feast or famine playstyle on the top side of the map, while not really bringing in any of the off the rift stuff. Irrelevant's a very interesting player to talk about because I think his playstyle has shifted so much since becoming a star at the pro level. When he joined Misfits, I was a huge fan of Irrelevant. I was really pushing this narrative that he was mega underrated on Misfits in his rookie year because he was the best weak side top laner in the LEC, and I don't even think it really was all that close. He was unbelievably good for that Misfits team. He goes over to SK and kind of has his breakout because he starts playing a lot more of that feast or famine style, and the good games look great and the bad games look awful. You know, it's kind of top lane in the LEC these days. It's top lane just in general, but I think Irrelevant should slot very nicely. I think he's not really going to be all that different from what Adam offered this team. There are going to be some games where he looks incredible, some games where he looks maybe not as incredible. Perhaps he ends up breaking into that top 1, top 2 conversation in terms of top laners in the LEC. People know that I've not necessarily been on the bandwagon for that. I've kind of been keeping him out of that top 1 or top 2 that Reddit seems to want to anoint him in, but he can very much get there on a team like this that does a good job of facilitating top lane, and I think a big reason for that is because I feel very good about the jungle position as well. 1-1-3 is going to be kind of the secondary option, I would guess, here for BDS. I imagine they tried really hard to keep Skewmond as well and to promote him up, but I imagine he was out of contract, and G2 was obviously a more enticing offer. But I'm going to say something crazy. 1-1-3 is really not all that bad of a consolation prize if you're looking for that. He was clearly the second best jungler in the ERLs this past year, and I think a lot of people are going to look back at his time on Astralis and say, oh, 1-1-3, we've already seen him at the LEC level, we've already seen what he can be, and it wasn't particularly good. He wasn't ready, and he wasn't, very good at all, really, at the LEC level when he was playing, but this is a completely different player. For those of you who didn't watch 1-1-3 this past year, this is a phenomenal promotion here for BDS, and I know they have different grades. I know 1-1-3 is coming in as a B- and Skewmond's coming in as a B, but I really didn't see a ton of difference in terms of like the actual talent level that those two players performed as. I think Skewmond had an easier role on BDS Academy than 1-1-3 did with K-Corp, and I think they played about equally as well, which could maybe even make the argument that 1-1-3 was more valuable to his team. It certainly is something to consider, but I think people, again, are going to underestimate just how good he has been over the past year because of what he was in the LEC before, and I think that is a mistake. The big criticism and concern for 1-1-3 when he was promoted to Astralis was that it was too soon, that he didn't really feel quite ready, that he didn't have a full grasp of the game. Well, he went back down to the LFL and got better and did all of the necessary steps to get called back up. I think, again, he's going to be somebody that's in the conversation for being a top 4, top 5 jungle from day one, in my opinion, in the LEC, and I really wouldn't be surprised if he's just better than Sheo throughout a majority of this year in terms of how the production ends up going. And so, as much as there is change here for BDS, I really like this offseason for them. I think you're basically going neutral in the top lane, going from one feast or famine top laner to another. That is, unless Irrelevant kind of gets that weak side top lane mentality back and starts to play a lot more consistent again, then I think you're really upgrading here in the top lane. But going to Paris in the support position, I love Paris. He's my number 1 prospect coming into the LEC. 1-1-3 is a player I'm much higher on than I think Consensus is right now. And Nuke had a great year. Ice is arguably the best AD carry in Europe. You just feel really good about this team and about the vibes kind of surrounding them. I think they were dealt a rough hand this offseason with the fact that they were basically guaranteed to lose Lebrav and they couldn't keep their star jungle prospect in Skewmond, but they did about as good of a job as any team could in making sure that they retained their core talent while actually bringing in some of the highest upside in the league. But then moving on now to kind of the surprising 5th place team from last year, it's going to be SK Gaming, and their offseason didn't quite go as well as I think some of the other teams. I still think that they're going to be more competitive than maybe other people are giving them credit for, because I do like, players on this team. I don't think that they are bad by any means. I think that they are very playable, but I just don't think anything on this team stands out unless you get another breakout performance here in the bot lane, which we will talk about in a second. Their lineup, at least for 2025, is looking like GIANTX in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Reeker in the mid lane, Rahel at AD carry, and Loopy at support. Of course, Rahel and Isma are the 2 remaining members from last year, and everybody here has played at top level somewhere, top level leagues somewhere, basically with the exception of Loopy. He's the one who's definitely the least experienced here, but they're bringing him back in with Rahel because they were DK Challengers bot lane partners together, and I think they're looking for that chemistry. We'll talk about why I really just don't like this decision in just a bit, but let's talk about the players that are obviously staying first. I think the grade that is going to catch a lot of people's eye first is going to be Rahel in the bot lane. He's my highest graded AD carry. People are going to be like, well, how can you say that? He got exposed in the playoffs. He got exposed in the season finals where he wasn't good enough. He clearly showed that regular season was fraud fraudulent, and I think there's reason to believe that that could be a possibility, but I just can't overlook like the mechanical prowess that he showed at his best in the regular season when he came over. In summer, like when you just look at the summer split, it wasn't even a conversation. He was the best AD carry in Europe. I think he was better than Ice in summer, even if I think Ice was really good, and even if he didn't carry that over all the time into the best of threes and then eventually the best of fives in the season finals, I think that there is reason to believe that with a more stable team around him, that could get back up to where it needs to be. Remember, he only played one split at the LEC level. We have such a small sample size, but the track record of, LCK Challengers players coming over to the LEC and succeeding, especially at the AD carry position, is incredibly high. I have a feeling this year is going to be better for him, or at least more consistent for him, and if he can play like he did in the regular season, like the entire year, that's easily the best AD carry in Europe. And so I know it feels a little bit presumptuous to give him that A- grade, but that's just kind of how I'm feeling going into the year. I feel like I'm expecting him to be the best AD carry in Europe, and if he's not, then I'm going to be a bit, disappointed. We'll talk about why I think there are maybe some concerns in terms of the surrounding core with that, but in terms of talent, it's definitely there. The mechanics are definitely there. That's not up for debate. And then you're also bringing Isma back. He was kind of your rookie addition last year. Some good and some bad with Isma's tape. I talked about it a lot. His winter split, phenomenal. And I think, you look at the first 2 or 3 games he played in the LEC, those were his best games that I've ever seen him play, including what he was playing at the ERL level. But it just kind of got worse and worse and worse as the year went on. He certainly got more and more scared and more passive in the early game, which I think is definitely a bit of a concern. But one of the big things that really intrigued me about Isma in the first place is that he was so aggro in terms of his level 3 ganks and his early game pathing. He reminded me a lot of a player in Malrang, who obviously we'll talk about a bit later in this video, but that did not carry over to the back half of the year. It really was not something that became a real thing for SK. They ended up just becoming this standard slow-paced team, and that really did not benefit them. They relied way too much on Rahel either just outplaying the 2v2 or Irrelevant just dominating the 1v1 on the top side and not really having any sort of coordinated play, and a lot of that I bring down to Isma just not really being a factor in the jungle. They're going to need that to change if he is going to be somebody that actually affects, this team in a positive way. Right now, he's coming in as a C+. I think that's really the only fair way to grade him. I think it's fine that he has a starting job, but he's got to prove that he deserves this second year. I think that he's on, some thin ice for me in terms of, what I'm expecting. But everybody else here is going to be a change. We'll talk about the BDS players first. GIANTX and Reeker are coming in as the solo lane duo here from BDS Academy, and I think this is fine. I'm not super sold on both of these players. I'm more sold on GIANTX. Again, very similar to 113 in the sense that I think people are going to look at his tenure in the LEC from a little while ago and say oh, he's just fine, right? He was a player who played for SK for a long time and never really was able to kind of break through and be a top 5 top laner. He was just very average to below average during his LEC tenure, but what he showed on BDS Academy this past year was incredible. He was spectacularly good for that BDS team, and I think that, again, there were times where he was the best player on the best team in the LFL, on the best team in the ERLs, the EU Masters winner, right? I think that GIANTX is going to get a bit underrated. I think he is a good top laner. The problem is he has to replace Irrelevant, who's one of the best top laners in the league. That's why I have to consider this a downgrade. That being said, I wouldn't be surprised if GIANTX was kind of close, top 5-ish. I think that his performance last year would indicate that he has it in him, mechanically speaking. And honestly, in terms of the production that he showed, it reminds me so much of that year that Adam spent on BDS Academy in the LFL and the ERLs and then came back up and continued to dominate because he got his mental back. That could be the case for GIANTX. Perhaps he just learned something about, beating people at that level that, got him a lot more comfortable at winning 1v1s because he was terrific in lane for BDS Academy. But, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I think that I have pretty high expectations for him considering his results last year, but again, he doesn't have the best track record to speak of before 2024. So it's, kind of finding a balancing act. I think B- is pretty fair there. And then Reeker. Reeker was a player that I was really going to bat for during his first LEC tenure, or at least before his first LEC tenure with Mad Lions, ends up getting replaced by Niski on that team, and they just get instantly better the moment that he is replaced. He goes back down to the ERLs. It takes him a bit of time to get the momentum back, but it feels like he got it back being on the best team in the ERLs last year. Replacing Niski is obviously a funny storyline considering the fact that Niski replaced him on Mad back in the day, but I'm more concerned about Reeker than I am about GIANTX, or I am about some of the other promotions from BDS Academy that felt like they are just sprinkled everywhere. I think Reeker has more concerning qualities. I think he's super consistent when he's able to play a little bit weaker side, when he doesn't have to be a focal point for this team. Perhaps that could be a positive if they want to play for GIANTX in the top lane, or, play for Rahel down in the bot lane. We'll see how that goes, but I just am not in love with his mechanical ceiling nearly as much as I was the first time he was coming up from the ERLs. I think that there are certainly some things to like, but I'm not sold that he's going to be anything other than at best a mid-tier mid laner at this level, which is why he comes in as a B-. I think his floor is relatively high in comparison to some of the other mid laners that are getting promoted. We'll talk about a lot of them as we go further along in this video, but I don't necessarily think his ceiling is as high as a lot of the other mid laners that are getting promoted. So it's kind of just where you want to find that balance. And honestly, if Isma and Reeker are one of the weaker mid-jungle duos in the entire league, I'm certainly not going to be surprised about that. I don't really love this decision. I think that there were other options available on the table that would have made me more excited, but again, we'll see what ends up happening. And then the big one for me is Loopy coming into the support position. I can get the thinking behind this. I can get the logic. I can follow the train here and just saying, we want to make this as comfortable for Rahel as possible. And likely he was the one who made this decision to move on from Luan and to bring in Loopy, the player that he played with on DK Challengers. But from a tape perspective, there is no justification for this decision. Luan was just better last year than Loopy was. Loopy was obviously playing in the LLA. He was playing for Isurus. They had kind of Worlds expectations, at least going into the year. I remember a lot of, LLA analysts talking about how Isurus should have been in that conversation. They were fine, but they weren't exceptional. You go back and watch Loopy's gameplay. He was fine for that team, but he wasn't really a star for Isurus last year. And even going back and watching his DK Challengers tape, it's good, it's okay, but Luan was really good for this team last year, and it felt like he had good chemistry with Rahel. It felt like you were building something with the two of them. To let Luan go in order to pick up Loopy, I'm gonna grade this as a downgrade, at least until I'm proven wrong. Maybe the chemistry is just super high. I got this wrong last year with Noah and Jun. I just underestimated how much two players wanting to play together would really affect the performance of both of the players, but Loopy's just not as mechanically talented as Luan is. At least watching the tape, that's the impression that I get. It's really hard to kind of view it another way. It really felt like SK had something with this bot lane, and to just kind of make the decision to move on, I do find it a bit more concerning. Perhaps there are other analysts that are going to feel differently. I know Loopy has a pretty big fan base in terms of the LCK Challengers League analysts, and obviously, that's one of the Tier 2 regions that I actually do watch relatively regularly alongside the NACL in North America, but I have never seen it be a star. I've never felt like I need Loopy on the team. I've never felt like that's the kind of decision that you have to make. And to disrupt what was a really promising bot lane for it, it's gotta work out. For now, it's gonna be considered a downgrade because I think Loopy right now is just worse than Luan, and you were already building something there. But again, maybe the chemistry ends up bleeding through. Some positives and some negatives. GIANTX is a downgrade because Irrelevant's really good, but I think GIANTX is fine. I think keeping Rahel is good, and if Loopy comes in and is what Luan was for this team, you're going to feel fine about it. But jungle mid is a real concern for me, and I think you might have downgraded in support as well. I don't feel great about SK's offseason. They're going to get one of the lower offseason grades for me in the entire LEC. Not all of it's their fault, but I do think they're maybe falling into the trap of picking up players that were on good ERL teams that maybe weren't the dominant players for that ERL team, weren't the reason that the team was good, and we'll see if that ends up biting them in the butt here in 2025. But then moving on to number 6 here in our final of the season final teams from last year, it is, of course, GIANTX, the big surprise to make the season finals last year. They are making a ton of changes kind of surrounding their young mid laner with hopefully a little bit more upside, hopefully even a little bit of a higher floor. I quite like the team that they have put around him. I don't think it's perfect, but I certainly do think that there is a lot to like about it, so let's go ahead and go over it. It is, of course, Lot in the top lane, Closer in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Jun at support. You've got a lot of players here that a lot of people are going to be familiar with, and only real one promotion from the LFL, with Lot coming up, of course, from Go. We'll talk about him last because I think he's definitely the most interesting piece to kind of tie everything together here, but of course, as per usual, we're going to start with the non-changes, and on GX, that's really just Jackie's in the mid lane, and Obviously, this was a no-brainer for GX, and they felt the same way. There were a lot of reports this offseason that a lot of teams were calling them, asking about Jackie's availability after how dominant he was at the end of last year, and rightfully so. Like, he has really emerged as one of the most interesting mid lane prospects in the LEC. It reminds me a lot of, and I know this isn't a particularly good comparison now, but it reminds me a lot of VTO's come up when he was on Misfits back in the day, where it just feels like this guy that didn't have as much hype coming out of the ERLs, makes it to the LEC and just kind of starts to develop that mechanical prowess. Now, obviously, I think Jackie's should be better than what VTO ended up turning into, but, it's this idea that Jackie's has really become kind of the premier mid lane prospect in all of Europe that we really didn't feel was going to be the case going into last year. He was a complete unknown, and so, GX definitely struck gold, and their scouting team definitely hit a home run in that regard, but there is a lot of talk and a lot of, oh, I can't believe GX is contract jailing Jackie's, and once again, I really just want to make this point as abundantly clear as I can in these videos. It feels like I do this every single offseason. I have the same conversation, but if a player is under contract and the team is building a winning team around him, or at least trying to build a winning team around him, he's not contract jailed. I'm sorry, he signed a 2-year deal with GIANTX. If they want to use him the next year, they should use him. He shouldn't just be allowed to leave because he wants to if he signed a 2-year deal. It's just how it goes, right? And so, props to GX for not budging and not saying, hey, we're not going to sell you just because, other teams want you, big high-profile teams want you. We want to keep you, we want to build around you, and we want you to bring us to Worlds because we think that that's possible. And honestly, I don't think they have a Worlds team here, but I think they're not as far off as maybe some people would like to indicate. So Jackie sticking around, I think, is fine. He's only going to get a B grade, mostly because I think people just genuinely forget how horrific he was in spring. Like, he was horrible in spring. He was arguably the worst mid laner in the LEC, maybe outside of Saken in the spring split. And so, yeah, like, he was amazing in summer, but it's not like he was a perfect player throughout all of 2024. And, if he's going to be what he was in summer throughout all of this year, then yeah, that grade's going to go up. He's going to be a B+. He's going to be an A-, because that's kind of what he was at the end of 2024. I just need to see that be more consistent over the course of an entire year, or at the very least, a majority of the year when it really counts. And so, it's not really the upside that I'm worried about when it comes to Jackie's. It's kind of just the floor, which we've not necessarily seen just yet. So I'm excited to see what happens with him, but they have surrounded him with a lot of, veteran players that are good and are like playoff Worlds caliber players that have been multiple times in the past, starting with the Fnatic bot lane, Noah and Jun coming in here. They get replaced on Fnatic. They wanted more consistency with Upset and with Mickey X. Again, I don't think those are necessarily bad moves for Fnatic. I think Noah versus Upset is certainly a conversation. I think Jun versus Mickey X is certainly a conversation, but for GX, this is a huge win. This is just an upgrade in both of these positions, in my opinion. Patrick has really kind of been on the downturn, I would say, in the last couple of years. I think there were people that were gonna say, like, oh, Patrick was always a player that was really, slow and passive and didn't really do a whole ton, but at his best, he was the best team fighter in the entire region, and you could really rely on him to be able to win late game team fights. It reminds me a lot of the way people talk about Ice right now. I think it was very similar, but that just wasn't there anymore last year. He was losing a lot of games in the early and in the mid game because his laning was just not very good. Ignar wasn't exactly like making it better, although I don't think Ignar was the entire problem. I still think he's a player that could perform well on a good team. He's always been the kind of player to play to the level of the teammates around him, which is not always a good thing, but Noah and Jun were undoubtedly better last year. This is an upgrade in both spots. Noah has ridiculous upside. Really, the only thing that's been holding Noah back is his mental. When he's out of form, when he is like really struggling, you can tell it takes a pretty big toll on him, and it just starts to get worse and worse and worse. And that's why, honestly, I think leaving Fnatic and going to a team like GIANTX might be a really good thing for him. It takes a lot of the spotlight away from him. He's not on one of the premier teams in Europe anymore. He can perhaps flow a little bit more under the radar and just kind of try to focus on the gameplay. That's what happened when he got off of social media towards the end of last year and was playing a lot better for Fnatic. And so I'm interested to see what happens here on GX. He really could emerge as one of the best ADCs in Europe. He has been in the past for short stretches of time. I just need to see it for long stretches of time before I feel super confident, which is why he gets the B grade. And then you've got Jun, who was just awesome last year. There's really nothing else to say. Winter was definitely a slow start, and I am still taking into account that when he played in the LCK, he was horrible. Like, he genuinely was unplayable at the LCK level, but the LEC is not the LCK. Like, a team like GX would be near the bottom of the LCK, and that means Jun's probably going to be functioning at a lot higher of a level, and he did get better. There were a lot of things that he felt a lot more comfortable doing in the LEC that he didn't feel comfortable doing in the LCK, but he was exceptionally good for Fnatic for long stretches of time. Last year, it was him and Razork versus the world, where Humanoid was really struggling, especially in the summer regular season. Noah was particularly inconsistent, but they did get better in summer, and then obviously Oscar would just have bad games every once in a while. Jun was a real contributing factor for why Fnatic was able to make back-to-back finals in 2024, and so it's really big for them to be able to bring in a player of that caliber, and I think this still could be a top 2, top 3 bot lane here for GIANTX. You pair that up with a really high upside mid laner in Jackie's, you've got an interesting combination there, and it's not like you have a horrible jungler here in Closer coming in. Now, I'm not nearly as high on Closer as maybe some K-Corp fans would be after last split or after last year. It just didn't really feel like it ever clicked in that same way. He felt like a passenger on that team, and that team generally lacked a lot of like critical decision making in key moments, and that was a big problem for them. I think Closer can be the kind of player that can come in and be a good facilitator, but I think he's long past the part of his career where he's just going to be like a huge positive. He's not 100 Thieves Closer anymore. I just don't think that that player is there. That being said, if you've got Jackie's and Noah and Jun all playing really well on the bottom side of the map and you just need that jungler that can be an early game facilitator, I think Closer can fill that role relatively well. And he was fine on K-Corp. He wasn't a problem for them. He just wasn't really like exceptionally good. I think going from Juhan to Closer, at least in my opinion, is very much a neutral change. It very much is like you're basically getting a slightly different style of player. Juhan likes to play Maokai and Sejuani, and Closer likes to play like Jarvan and Vi a little bit more, and you know, that's really like the main difference. I think in terms of talent level, in terms of what they offer and bring to the team, I think it's very similar. And so I don't think you're losing all that much there, but I don't think he's going to be asked to be a primary option. And then the real interesting one is bringing Lot into the top lane, obviously from Go in the LFL. Antonio was shockingly good last year. I think that there was a lot of expectation that he was just not going to be like a particularly good player, that he was an internal promotion because they didn't want to go out and spend a ton of money on somebody to come in mid-year. And Antonio was, for large stretches of time, this team's second best player by a large margin. He was a top 5-ish top laner in the LEC, and so I was a bit surprised to see them go in a different direction. Maybe they just really like the upside of Lot, but I don't necessarily love this change. I think Antonio, again, showed a lot of really interesting flashes, and maybe he just wanted to retire, but Lot's okay, right? Like, he's going to be one of the lower graded top laners that's coming up from the ERLs. There's a ton, by the way. There were a ton of top lane promotions, a ton of promotions just in general, but, you know, Lot is one of the ones I'm less sure about, I'll just say. I think he's certainly one of the ones with more to prove. Go was a fine team, but certainly a bot lane focused team. When you watch them play in the LFL, Jezu was really kind of the star of that Go team in terms of how much they played through the bottom side of the map, and so we'll see. Maybe he's just coming in to be a really good weak side top laner. He's got that Turkish connection with Closer in terms of, you know, how they can link up, but I think if there is one part of the map that I'm a bit more concerned about when it comes to GX, it is the top side. It's Lot and Closer. It's whether or not those two are going to be like good enough to justify being close to top 4. I think this team has a really good core. I think Jackie's, Noah, and Jun as like a 3-man trio is really strong. And honestly, like in the best case scenario, that's like a top 3 team. That's a Worlds, you know, trio in terms of the production that you could get from them. But again, the top side of the map absolutely does concern me. That being said, maybe Lot's really good. Maybe they saw something like they saw in Jackie's the year before that I'm just not seeing on tape. Maybe Closer actually has a better year than what he had for K-Corp last year, and Noah and Jun can really thrive now that they're out of the spotlight. Jackie's takes that leap and becomes, you know, a top 5 player in the LEC. Like, I think all of these things are possible for this team. The upside is very much there, which is why I think their offseason is a huge success, going from a team that nobody really like had a lot of faith in, that overperformed incredibly by even getting 6th last year, to a team that probably should be in the top 6 or top 5 conversations going into next year. I don't exactly know what 2025 looks like for GX, but I think this was a really good offseason and a lot of really good punts here. But then moving on now to the number 7 team, our first team who did not make the season finals last year. It is, of course, K-Corp. They came very close. They honestly probably were one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the LEC by the end of last year, but they shot themselves in the foot so much at the start of the year that they weren't able to actually prove that in the season finals, even after finishing 3rd in the summer split. And honestly, they just got better. Basically everywhere across the board. Their no changes are generally fine. We'll talk about that. Obviously, there's a big elephant in the room when it comes to the grades on this page, but their additions are majorly positive and I think give a lot of room for upside moving into 2025. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Vladi in the mid lane, Kalista at AD carry, and Targamas at support. This is a really intriguing roster. Obviously, people are going to want me to talk about Kalista first, but I'll get to him later. I obviously talk about the no changes. First, you're keeping Kana, Vladi, and Targamas. Of the ones that are being retained, the one I'm the most excited about is Vladi in the mid lane, who looked excellent down the stretch for K-Corp at times, was one of their best players. I look at him pretty similarly to how I look at Jackie's. I think either of them could have this big breakout in 2025, and I really wouldn't be all that surprised. It's really nice to see some young mid lane talent come up through the ranks and genuinely look as good as they have. You know, Vladi wasn't somebody that I was expecting to really dominate from day one, but he picked up the LEC tempo and level really, really fast and genuinely became one of the scarier mid laners to face down the stretch of the summer split. Hopefully that's really good, you know, moving forward. We just have such a small sample size when it comes to him as a mid laner. It's why I can't give him higher than a B at the current moment, because we've really only seen him play one split, and that split was really good, but he's going to have to do it for a more consistent period of time. So for now, you know, I'm very happy that obviously he's being retained. That was probably never really up for debate. I imagine he was the one player that was guaranteed to come back for this team, but it's really nice to see that, you know, they've been able to build around him as well. You know, Kana coming back, I think, is generally fine. I'm not quite as high on what Kana was last year as maybe some other analysts will be. You know, Kana's always been a player that I think has been good on good teams and fine on average teams. When he's taken out of his comfort zone, when he kind of has to be a more dominant 1v1 player on the top side, I just don't think that's necessarily like the game that he wants to play. I think when he's allowed to just play for the team, play for the team fights, I think that's where he's going to be the most comfortable, which is why he comes in as a B. For a lot of this year, he'll probably perform closer to being like a B plus, somewhere in that range, but again, import, you know, knocked down the grade a little bit, so he's going to be, he was already kind of on the edge of B plus and B. He's going to move down to B because of that import status. And then Targamas is, of course, the other player that you're bringing back. This is the biggest question mark, I think, in the entire LEC offseason for me. I'm not surprised that this is happening because we already kind of knew that this was happening. Targamas was on K-Corp in the first place because Kalista wanted to play with him at the LEC level, or at least that's what the report is, and, you know, Kalista was getting promoted. He was finally old enough to play in the LEC this year, and so Targamas is sticking around, but I think you can make a really solid argument that Targamas was the single worst player in the LEC last year. I honestly don't even think there's a lot of, like, people in that conversation outside of him. He just was terrible for K-Corp, and it's not like going back a year before that he was any better playing for Excel. He was benched one split into the year because he was really kind of a problem for that team. Now, there is some merit to saying that he has been a bit of a scapegoat on both of those rosters. He certainly was on Excel. I don't think everything was entirely his problem, but he was, you know, not entirely a scapegoat, I would say, on K-Corp. There were definitely some problems with him last year where he just wasn't allowing players like Upset to actually be able to win them games because he was constantly putting his team in bad positions with his own positioning and his aggressiveness. It just wasn't working out. And honestly, outside of the one G2 year, he has never been good at the LEC level. He is the lowest graded player in this video, coming in at a C. If you remember, my C grade is, like, you really got to prove that you deserve this spot. He is the hottest of hot seats in the LEC for me. If he's handpicked by this superstar AD carry prospect to come in and be the guy to help, you know, guide that transition, then great. But if Kalista struggles, a lot of people are going to start pointing fingers at Targamas, and I think that that is generally a fair assessment. But the new additions, I've already talked about them quite a lot. Let's get into it. Kalista in the bot lane. People are going to maybe anoint him a little bit higher than this B grade from day one. I like Kalista's tape, and I understand why he's being considered as such a big AD carry prospect, but my big off-season hot take is, from a mechanics perspective, I don't see a gigantic difference between him and a lot of the other big AD carries that have come up through the system in the past couple of years. You know, Supa last year, or even someone like a Jack Spectra a couple of years ago, and Jack Spectra last year in the ERLs as well. Like, I think he's comparable to those players, at least more comparable than he gets credit for, even if he is a little bit better, which I do, you know, I can see the upside. I get why people, especially if you go back 2 years ago, I can see why people are all in on the Kalista bandwagon, why Karmine Corp is so in on the Kalista bandwagon. However, I'm not sold that he's going to come in and be 100% of a game breaker day number one. He might be. He's got the mechanical talent to be able to do so, but I think there are some things pushing against that narrative in my eyes. First off, rookie AD carries have really struggled in recent years, basically with the exception of Supa, and even Supa definitely struggled at times during his rookie year. It's been really difficult for young AD carries to adapt and immediately become game breakers. You either have to be, you know, more experienced coming from Korea, when you look at, you know, rookies, quote unquote, players like Noah and Ice. You know, Ice had played in the LCK, Noah had been in the Challengers League for such a long time. Like, these were not, you know, traditional rookies in that same sense, or you have to be somebody that, takes a couple of years to get going. I look at someone like Flackid, who really took some time to like establish himself as a really solid AD carry at this level. It just doesn't happen super quickly, at least it hasn't in recent years. And so, I think there is some worry that Kalista might be a little bit overhyped from day one. Again, I think he can grow into that role. But I think another thing is that his tape last year was really good, and it wasn't like really great. And I think that that is something that maybe I'm grappling with. Is I went and watched his 2024 tape, and I'm like, he's a good player, but he's not like he wasn't the best player on K-Corp last year. That was 113. At least in my opinion, he was the one influencing a lot of those games. And Kalista was more so just kind of along for the ride, using his mechanics to kind of, separate himself. He wasn't the focal point for that team. And I think that that's something that, with the narrative that's being painted around him, I wasn't expecting going and watching his film. Now, that being said, his 2023 film is everything that you could want and then some. He absolutely has played at the level of an elite prospect before, but I think if it was just the 2024 tape, there would be a slightly different conversation surrounding him. That being said, I'm basically looking for nitpicks at this point when it comes to this player. Like, he's the hypest prospect I've seen enter the LEC in forever, maybe ever. I mean, the report this offseason was that they were offered a package of Yike, Hansama, and Mickey X for Kalista, and they turned it down. They said no. K-Corp said no, and that's insane. And basically, the expectation is for him to come in and be an all-pro from day number one. If that's not the case, it's going to be, a little bit shocking, but especially playing with Targamas, who I really don't trust in the support position right now, I'm not sold this is going to be a 2v2 that just blows people away from day number one. It's kind of a wait and see for me. I will say the big upgrade here is clearly Yike coming into the jungle. Whatever you think of closer, Yike was just phenomenal last year. He was excellent throughout basically the entire year, with the exception of season finals, where people blame him for the way things ended up going down. But I'm sorry, I just can't rank Yike any lower than an A-. He would have been an A if he had not struggled in the season finals. It really was that good of a year for Yike for a majority of the year. He was easily the second best player on G2 for most of 2024, a team that just felt like they couldn't lose. His chemistry with Caps was gigantic, and I think what's really encouraging for me is not only that he's getting better, but the narrative on him coming into the league was always, he's a carry jungle player, he doesn't play tanks, he can't play facilitators, he has to be a primary option for the team, and that's just not true anymore. That is very much not the case in 2024 or 2025 and moving forward. He was awesome on things like Sejuani and Maokai and facilitators last year. He has really grown in to being a more complete player. Playing with G2 will definitely do that. The question is he going to be able to succeed when he doesn't have these lanes that are constantly winning like G2's were? Yike sometimes struggled last year to be able to make impacts in the early game because G2 generally struggled in the early game. They got their shit together because their macro was so good, but, Yike was a big part of why that team struggled to be like an early game dominant team. Is that going to be a problem in 2025 now that he doesn't have Caps, now that he doesn't have Broken Blade or even Hansama, who's a great laner? That's going to be something that's up for debate. It's not like Kana, Vladi, and Kalista are bad players, but, Kana is certainly not the dominating top lane that Broken Blade is. I think Vladi obviously isn't Caps. He's not expected to be, and Kalista's a rookie. You don't know what you're going to get, especially with Targamas at support. And so, Yike's role is definitely going to be a lot different on this team. I think that he's going to come in and kind of be expected to be the star of the team basically from day one, at least in my opinion, next to Kalista. And I just don't know if that's a role that he's ready for. It's definitely the biggest test he's had, and we'll see. I'm excited for it. I think he's going to pass. That's why I'm considering this an upgrade. It's why I've given him an A- grade, because even with all these reservations, I still think he's going to be able to make it work. And I think generally K-Corp's offseason was really good. I think it would be like an A+ if they got a different support, like if they just, brought in basically anybody else, even Fleshy coming up from, their team in the LFL, I think would have been a better choice here for me than Targamas, but alas, we're sitting here with one major question mark on an otherwise really solid roster that has really good upside with the carry duo. And, for K-Corp, a team that went 10th at the start of last year, I just don't see that being kind of a reality for them moving into 2025. Then moving on now to number 8 from last year, and it's a team that very much disappointed and went through a lot of changes. It's Team Heretics, and let's just say the changes are not done. They are definitely not done with going through a lot of the learning processes of trying to find something that can stick. Now, there is one remaining player, which I think was the right decision. I think if you were going to bring somebody back, you probably brought back the right player. Now, Yankos obviously would have been great, but I don't think he was ever coming back to this team outside of Yankos. Flackid is definitely the one you would want returning. I'm pretty high on him. I think he's just been a very good ADC the last 2 years. He's been somebody that I think has been very valuable for this Heretics organization, and so I'm fine with you bringing him back, but every other decision here is certainly a decision, and I'll get into some of the positives and negatives of that a little bit later. But their lineup is looking like Karlsson in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Kemalu in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Stend at support. You've got 3 players that you are promoting up here through various ERLs, and we'll get to them when we get to them. But I want to start, of course, with Flacket, a player who I do think is, at this point, a bit underrated. I think he's a lot closer to being the #1 AD carry in Europe than a lot of people want to give him credit for. All he has been for this team ever since getting re-promoted midway through 2023 has been a really stable, really consistently positive piece for this team. He's good in lane, he's good in team fights, he doesn't make major errors, and he can take over games if you give him a lot of resources early on. He's just a really well-rounded player. I'm honestly surprised that people aren't talking him up nearly as much as I am, but if he comes out and just like dominates this year, especially because the rest of this team is probably going to be looking to him as a primary carry, that's going to be not that shocking to me. I believe in Flacket. I believe in him as a player, and I believe he's somebody that can play like on a top 1, top 2 team. He's already done it with G2, but he's better right now than he was on G2 individually as a player. I think it's just a little bit disappointing that he probably won't get the chance to show that off all that much this year because the rest of this team is so uncertain, and I have some major concerns. So let's talk about the other positives first before we get into some of the more concerning bits. Sheo coming in to play jungle. This is a very proven jungle player at this level. Like, there's really not a lot to say about Sheo. I'm a little bit lower on him than a lot of other analysts are. I think he's been a good, like slightly above average jungler. I think he's been helped out by the fact that his laners have been really good. He's gotten to play with players like Ice, who just love scaling. He's gotten to play with Labrav, who basically does his job for him for half of the game. And, you know, Nuke had a great year last year. Like, he's been in a really good situation with BDS. I don't think he's a superstar. I think a lot of people are going to hype him up to be more than he is. I just think he's a solid jungler. I'm worried that he's going to look really bad on this team. It honestly reminds me a lot of Marcoon going to Rogue last year, where, you know, Marcoon's a really good jungler. He's really stable. He's proven he can play at the LEC level, but you put him on a team with like no lane support, and he just doesn't really have the skill set to be able to like elevate that and make it better than what it is, especially because this team is going from Jankos to Sheo, which is a downgrade. Regardless of how good you think Sheo is, Jankos was better last year and has been better for, you know, his entire career. This is not an upgrade, and, you know, there is concern about whether or not Sheo can elevate the rookie solo laners to be, you know, competent really in any way. So we'll have to see when it comes to that, but at least for now, he's going to get a B grade. I think this is relatively fair. He's a good player, not a star. I don't think he's like around the B+ area. I think this was a pretty clear B for me, and this kind of represents what that grade means. But the other player that I'm actually kind of excited about is going to be Stend in the support position. He's not Paris as a prospect, but honestly, he's really not entirely far off. I was super pleasantly surprised getting to Stend's tape. I really wasn't expecting him to be someone that I was super excited about. I hadn't really heard about him a ton throughout the year, but going and watching a lot of the games, I've only watched probably about 9 or 10 at this point, so I don't have like a full breadth of knowledge, but, you know, we'll get to that when we get to the power rankings later on in the year. But from what I've seen so far, I really like the way he plays the map, and I think, you know, Flacket and Stend could be a really scary 2v2 to have to play into. I don't think they're going to be like sensationally stars or anything like that, but he certainly deserves better than a C+. He's not just a guy getting promoted. He should come in and be a pretty stable, a pretty solid support, or at least that's kind of what I would expect. I don't think this is the best surrounding core to get the most out of him, but of the rookies that are getting promoted here, you know, for Heretics from the ERLs, he's the one that I felt the best about coming back and watching the tape, and that's a good sign, because again, Flacket is kind of your star player here. If you can get your bot lane rolling, that gives you a very clear win condition that can let you get over a lot of teams that are kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of the results, and so that's good, but then we have to get into the solo laner conversation, and this is where things get a little bit worse. Karlsson's coming into the top lane. It's an internal promotion. I think this is fine. I don't really have a huge issue with this. Karlsson, to me, was very similar to someone like Lot that I already talked about with GIANTX, where, you know, it's just really hard to evaluate him because, at least in Karlsson's case, he had such a dominant player on his team that, you know, he didn't really get any resources. Jack Spectra was obliterating that league. Los Heretics was not carried on its back by Jack, but, like, he was so dominant last year that it's really hard to get an idea of, like, what Karlsson can do if given resources. For now, I'm just going to give him a C+ grade. He was really good at all the things he was asked to do, but he was asked to do so much less than a lot of the top laners that are coming in. He's certainly not one of the top, like, main top laners coming in. Like, you know, we'll talk about Knock Knocko later. He's not that. Like, he's not that kind of prospect. He's just an interesting player with a couple of, interesting mechanics that wasn't really given a big role before getting promoted to the LEC. Clearly, they like something from him because of the internal promotion, but it's really going to be kind of to be determined to see how that ends up working out. And then really the big question mark for me is going to be Kamalu in the mid lane. I mean, everybody's going to be talking about this, and everybody already has talked about this, but I think it's even worse than people are giving it credit for. I see a lot of comparisons to someone like Jackie's from last year, and on the surface, at least, when I approached this, I thought it was going to be very similar. A player who just wasn't really playing a lot of like LEC adjacent players regularly, but was dominating their own little league, and was so interesting that, a team with a really good scouting department decided to take a big punt on a player with really good mechanics. But there are some massive differences between what Jackie's was last year and what Kamalu was. Jackie's, at the very least, was able to get some exposure with EU Masters, playing with Entropic, and, at least got some games outside of the Czech League to look really good. Kamalu obviously didn't get that, exclusively played in the LFL Tier 2, but even outside of that, I watched like 10 games of his. He was fine at the LFL Tier 2 level. Like, he was okay, but he wasn't like unbelievable. He wasn't obliterating the competition like someone like Jackie's was. When you're going to be playing in one of these lower leagues, to get promoted to the LEC, my first thought is, oh, you're like the best player in your league by far. You're so much better than the players you're playing against that it's worth the punt to see if you can translate that to a higher level, kind of skipping a step. I didn't see that at all in Kamalu, and so I really don't know what this decision is. Clearly, they've seen something, and you know what? I'm far from the person to sit here and judge like a team that clearly has their eye on a player that not everybody else would go for. This is clearly kind of a project decision. They have a lot of faith and trust in him, or they wouldn't have picked him because he didn't have any sort of fan base, or this is not like the easy choice. You know what I mean? It's not the easy choice to go for a player who's never played, even at the Tier 2 level, but I gotta see it, man, because I have not seen it so far in the tape that I've watched. This is truly puzzling. Honestly, I was very close to giving him a C- grade because, again, I just have not seen anything that leads me to believe that this guy could play at the LEC level, but he hasn't played yet, and so I don't want to give him a C- before he's played a single game. That's usually reserved for players that have proven that they do not belong at this level, but yeah, that's a downgrade, and I already wasn't like the biggest fan of Zviru, who was already super inconsistent. You're downgrading in the top lane, even if you don't think Wunder was particularly good for this team, which he wasn't last year. Obviously, jungle's a downgrade because you're losing Yankos. I think you might have a better bot lane because I think Stend is really interesting as a prospect, and Flakkid might even be getting more resources this year, which he already started to do at the end of last year, but there are some major question marks when it comes to Heretics. They took some punts this offseason. They really trusted their gut, they trusted their scouting system, and I guess it's to be determined whether or not that works out. But we're moving on now to number 9, and it's the other team that is really trying to go in a youthful direction, we'll just say, outside of Team Heretics. It's Team Vitality. A lot of things have really not worked out for this organization over the last few years, and I think they've realized their mistakes, and now they are finally starting to invest in some of the young players that have been coming through their Vitality B system. They started to try and do that last year with Douglas. Didn't necessarily work out. They were able to pick up Linsas halfway through the year, and that did make them better. Like, Linsas was, I would say, a little bit better than Douglas. Not that it was like a ton, but I think he gives you more upside even if he wasn't perfect, and now they're bringing up 2 of their own in-house solo laners to take over jobs for players like Photon and VTO that have been really big difference makers at this level. You are retaining the bot lane, which I think is fine. Obviously, I'm going to get a ton of criticism for putting Carzzy at B, because every year I get criticism for not saying that Carzzy is the number 1 or number 2 AD carry in the LEC. He's just hyper inconsistent. We'll talk about them first. Carzzy and Hilly are going to stay at B for now as a bot lane duo. Carzzy was definitely better than Hillis was last year. Hilly had a lot of problems, and for the most part was just kind of a negative for Vitality, but I'm ranking Hilly on what I expect him to be moving forward, and that to me is probably like a B caliber player, an inconsistently very good player. That's Carzzy. Like, I know people really hate when I say this, but every single year I feel like I get proven right over and over again, and yet I get it. He's a really fun personality and people really like him, but he's just mega inconsistent. You're just not going to get 3 straight good splits of Carzzy. You're just not. Like, there is no universe in which you are going to be able to get that really at any point. And so, you just have to live with it. You're going to have 2, maybe like a split and a half to 2 splits a year where the guy's awesome, where he's borderline top 2, top 3, but if there won't be 1 week every single split that he just completely runs it and is one of the worst players in the league. Like, it's just who he is. It's what he's done every single year. If you want to take that trade-off, if you want to say that it's worth it or it's more valuable to have the good games of Carzzy, even if you put up with the bad games, than it is to have, you know, Flacket or whatever, then go ahead and take that argument. I'm just not going to make that argument. I think Carzzy is a very, very good player that on any given day can completely run an LEC game and can completely take over. I just don't know what games he's going to do that in and what games he's going to completely run it in, because you just have to kind of live with both. And so I know I've talked a lot about Carzzy on this channel, but I basically continuously get comments on, you know, how my view on Carzzy is stupid and dumb, and every single year he proves me right. And so I just don't really know what else to do at this point. Hylissang is another player that I think is, you know, he's just inconsistent. His bad games are horrible. They're some of the worst in the entire league, and last year was a lot of bad games from him when this team wasn't doing particularly well. But good Hylissang is still in there. We saw that in 2023. I firmly believe that in a better situation, you know, a lot of those risky, aggressive plays could work out, you know, very similar to what I said about Mickey X in terms of analysis, where it's hard to just kind of, you know, only look at the bad when, you know, generally as an aggressive support, you're just going to run into a lot of bad. You kind of have to live with that. It's all just about balancing it out. He's fine as a player. I don't hate them keeping him around if they feel like him and Carzzy have very good synergy. But the rest of this team is where the question marks obviously come in. Linsas is the only other returning player here coming back in the jungle. Again, he was a very late addition last year as a replacement for Douglas. You know, Linsas should have been in the LEC long before that. I was really kind of, you know, crying wolf for a long time that he didn't have an LEC job at the start of 2024, ended up getting the spot here on Vitality, and I think he was fine for this team. I don't think he was exceptional. There were parts of his game that I felt were good and, you know, translated the way I thought they would to the LEC. There were also parts of his game that did not translate nearly as well as I expected them to the LEC, and so we'll see if he can take that next leap here in 2025. Again, a very small sample size when it comes to him for now. C+ I think is relatively fair. And then you're promoting internally at both of your solo lane spots. I want to talk about Knock first, because I do think that he is the more interesting of the two solo laners. GIANTX will get in a second, but Knock is really a great addition here for Vitality. I know it says downgrade, and some people are going to be frustrated by that, but really, this is not a bad decision to promote Knock and to go in a different direction. The problem is that Photon is just such a difference maker. I have him rated as an A- top laner, even though he's an import. That's how much of a difference maker I think he has been for Vitality. I think he has been, you know, pretty inarguably a top 2 or top 3 top laner ever since joining the LEC. He was exceptional in year 1, you know, didn't have quite as much of a spotlight in year 2 when things were going wrong for Vitality, but he is a phenomenal player, and this is a downgrade in the short term. However, if this is an upgrade in the long term, I'm not going to be all that surprised. Knock is easily my favorite of the rookie top laners coming up. You know, I'm not sure if you count GIANTX as, you know, an ERL promotion, but he's right up there with GIANTX, you know, to me, in terms of interesting players coming up to the LEC. I really do think he could be, you know, a top 4, top 5 top laner from day one and could grow into a top 2, top 3 guy very quickly. I really like his game, and I think he is definitely, you know, worthy of this promotion, and I'm excited to see him in the LEC. It just always is going to suck losing a player at Photon's level. If you lose a player rated in the A's, for me, you're just going to get downgraded unless you've replaced him with another A-graded player, because you don't come across those very often. Even if Knock turns into a very good, like, B+ caliber player, it just sucks to be losing someone of Photon's quality, in my opinion. But the mid lane change is definitely a little bit more interesting to talk about. You're going from VTO to GIANTX. I think this is an okay change, again, an internal promotion. I'm not nearly as high on GIANTX as I think other people are. He's kind of in that category, again, to me, with a lot of these mid laners that I was just shocked were so highly prioritized throughout the beginning of this free agency process. I think he's a little bit of a worse version of what we explained with Reeker earlier. I think Reeker definitely had a better track record, and I think I like Reeker's, like, ERL runs a lot more than I like GIANTX, but GIANTX's not a bad player. He's just not, like, an exceptionally dominant player. I think Knock was definitely the more interesting of the solo lane duos here, and GIANTX is definitely more kind of filling a role of, oh, okay, we'll wait and see. That's why he's getting a C+. Some people might even be mad to see VTO considered a C+. You know, I still believe that VTO has talent to be able to figure it out. His mental is just completely gone. His, you know, decision-making is horrid at this point in his career, but, you know, GIANTX should be an upgrade from what they got from VTO last year, so long as he's, like, remotely stable. And, you know, mid laners are always difficult to tell, especially at the LEC level. I just don't see as much in him as I see in a lot of the other mid lane promotions, and I do think he's a lot closer to being, like, like, you know, a C plus or like where Kamalu is at a C than he is to being, you know, one of the really, really great mid lane promotions, or even one of the, like, you know, upper tier ones like Reeker was. And so I don't want to criticize GIANTX too much. I just don't really know how much to trust him at the current moment, but I really like Knock Knocko. I loved Linsas for a lot of years. I think that could be a very good top side, and Karzi and Hilly can have a couple of really good games. There is definitely a world in which this team just kind of is the Mad Lions of this year and gets like top 4, top 5 for basically no reason, because they have a couple of veterans to guide a lot of these really talented young players through, but that is requiring a lot of leaps. You know, as much as I like Knock Knocko, I don't think top lane's one of those roles that I'm just expecting to dominate at the LEC level. Karzi and Hilly are crazy inconsistent, and, you know, Linsas hasn't really shown anything at the LEC level. I'm not the biggest fan of GIANTX in the world, and so there are concerns about this team. I'm not expecting them to be like world beaters, but I do think that I can understand the direction that they're going in, and I'm certainly not nearly as critical of the signings that they made from the ERLs as I am for a team like Team Heretics. But that's going to bring us to our 10th and final team here from last year, and it's the team that was by far the worst throughout the entire year, the laughingstock of the LEC last year. It's Rogue, and I'm kind of surprised to see this brand still in effect. There were so many rumors that they were not going to hold an LEC spot going into 2025, but here we are. They are going to hold an LEC spot, and honestly, kind of surprisingly, they put together, you know, a pretty interesting roster. I say that, but the first thing I really want to say about this group of 5 players is this is the exact same strategy that they employed last year, which is throw a bunch of darts at players that are in like buy low mode, like buy low on every player that you can on your lineup and hope that they can all turn it back around to when they were good. I think that it's possible for this team to be able to execute something like that. But again, that's the strategy they tried last year, bringing in players like Marcoon, bringing in, you know, I mean, keeping comp, I would say overall, you know, Shigenda in the top lane and then eventually Finn. Like, you brought in a bunch of players who have been good at this level, but weren't exactly great at this level. And, you know, we're kind of on the downturn, and then all of it collapsed because you didn't really think about play styles. And this was the slowest, most passive team in the world because it's Marcoon, who is a late game team fight, you know, scaling oriented jungler, and Larson, who has never made a play pre 10 minutes in his entire life. Like, it ends up being a really bad, like, set of circumstances. I don't think you run into that same play style problem with the 2025 roster, but I do think that there are still concerns about, you know, whether or not these players are even, like, good anymore. You know, they're all really on the downturn, and I'll talk about that with really the exception of one. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Adam in the top lane, Malrang in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Execute at support. Larson, the main member that's retained here, he is Rogue for life. This guy has been a part of the good and the bad when it comes to this organization, and I really like keeping him around here. It was not his fault that this team was bad last year. I'm not going to say that he was like a solution for this team, but I think in the right circumstances, Larson can still be a very dangerous mid laner to play into. The problem for Larson is that he lost his go button in the early game, which was Malrang for so many years. He was so used to Malrang like taking over a lot of these early game level 3, level 4, you know, big plays, and then kind of playing off of that, being allowed to scale into the late game and being the big team fight threat for his individual team. When Marcoon wasn't really providing that early game threat, Larson's like scaling just became so much more difficult because the enemy team was just getting so many resources for free, and he was always having to fight from disadvantaged states. He was always down in gold, and that was a huge issue for Rogue generally, but I think this is a team that's much better suited to be able to deal with that throughout the rest of this year. So I like keeping him around. I like him being kind of the pseudo team captain, the org representative here for Rogue, but everything else is a big question mark. I think the big upgrade for me, the one I feel the best about, is certainly in the top lane, and that's Adam coming in from BDS. I will continue to be an Adam defender. I can't tell you what's going on behind the scenes. I can't tell you about any of the, you know, backstage problems or any of the communication issues that he has had. He's been benched a couple of times now, not only by BDS, of course, famously by Fnatic, and getting into arguments with teammates and, you know, coaches and yada, yada, yada. He's certainly had his, you know, fair share of reports of things not going well, but all I can comment on is what I see on the tape on the Rift, and Adam's a phenomenal League of Legends player. This guy is an actual game changer. He's an MVP caliber player when he is playing at the highest of his levels. Now, again, very similar to what we've said about basically everybody in this video, he had a rough end to 2024. He really was not playing well at the end of the year, and he cost BDS. He was horrific in the summer playoffs and horrific in the season finals as well. He's a big reason why they missed Worlds, in my opinion, and that's certainly something that's going to linger on my mind, but he's been so good for 2 years before that I still believe that he can be a top-tier top laner at this level. Mechanically speaking, he's the #1 top laner in the LEC, and it's not particularly close. It's always just been about consistency. When it comes to Adam, I will continue to be high on him until he gives me a prolonged reason to not be. So far, at least in terms of gameplay, he hasn't given me that. I think this is a great addition and a huge upgrade for Rogue in the top lane. They're going to feel very lucky to be able to pick him up so long as there isn't any major issues when it comes to his, out-of-game stuff. But basically every other change, every other addition on this roster is, questionable in some way, shape, or form, even if they're considered upgrades. We'll, of course, start with Malrang in the jungle. People are going to be really excited to see this, reuniting Malrang and Larssen, who have basically polar opposite styles that have played off of each other incredibly well in the past, have been able to make it to the quarterfinals of Worlds in the past as a duo. I think a lot of people off name value are going to be very excited for this. However, I want to, direct people's attention to Malrang's 2024, and I know it's going to be easy to say, well, whatever, he was in Brazil and he wasn't giving it his all, but this is a guy who was playing for Kaboom. They brought him in because they wanted to try and at least compete to make Worlds, and he was so bad for the team that they had to bench him in the middle of the summer split, and then the guy he got replaced by, a Brazilian, academy prospect for them, just came in and completely turned around Kaboom's season, was an actual, functional jungler and allowed them to play the game. They still weren't very good. They were still one of the weaker teams in the CB LoL, but they were infinitely better the moment they stopped playing Malrang, and that's not a real good sign. It's not like the CB LoL was, unbelievably good or uncharacteristically good last year. It's traditionally the CB LoL level. They weren't better or worse than they normally are, and Malrang wasn't even a competent CB LoL jungler. This is a player that, at least in terms of performance from a scaling perspective, was playing at a tier 3 level, was a C graded player from his performances last year, even a C minus, somewhere in that range. That's what he was in 2024, and the tape backs that up. This dude was horrible last year, unplayably bad. You're just hoping that bringing him back into an organization and a system that he's comfortable with, and bringing him back to the LEC where he's found basically all of his pro success, you're hoping that can turn him into a functional jungler again. But this is a big risk. If he sucks, if he's even half of what he was in 2024, this team's going to be horrendous because they do not have a lot of options for aggressiveness outside of Malrang and maybe Adam on the top side of the map. And so, I'm not loving the Malrang edition. I certainly would have liked to see something a little bit more proven come into the jungle, but again, he's had such good synergy with Larssen. I have to consider this a change. I think this is arguably a downgrade in terms of even what Marcoon offered, and he was horrible last year, but Malrang really was that bad for Kaboom in 2024, so just something to keep in mind. And then the bot lane, a very interesting duo here. You've got Patrick and Execute. Patrick coming over from GIANTX. He's finally left Excel. He's been on that team and that org for 5 years or something. Feels like he's become kind of the franchise player for them, but he comes over here to Rogue after Excel wants to go in the Fnatic direction, which I like. But Patrick is really kind of past his prime. He's really not the player that he was 2 or 3 years ago in terms of the mechanics that he's offering. He's just going to have a couple of games where he gets obliterated in the 2v2, and you kind of just have to live with that. That being said, he's still an upgrade over Comp, who was unplayable last year. I mean, he was horrible, easily the worst AD carry in Europe, and it wasn't even remotely close. Comp is not a very good League of Legends player. I think the unfortunate truth is that whatever happened in 2022 was just a major outlier. He was bad before 2022. He's been bad after 2022. There's just really no other thing to say other than it was miraculous that they were able to get that year out of him. But Patrick coming in, even if I do think Patrick's on the downswing, he's still a remotely stable AD carry that you hope you can hide the problems in the early game with. If he can get to the late game team fights, he's still pretty good in that phase, but he's really not been all that consistent. And his decision making in particular has been really bad over the past year or so. So definitely something to keep in mind. And then Execute, another buy low kind of player. This is a guy who got benched by FearX last year in the LCK. Of course, longtime LEC fans will remember him as Jonghoon on Astralis, a couple of years ago. I'm saying long time, but if you've been watching for more than 2 years, you'll remember Jonghoon goes back to the LCK, changes his name to Execute, and gets benched on FearX for being easily the worst player on that team. Again, as somebody who covers the LCK every single game, Execute was really bad. I wanted to give him a lot of grace because he was so good in the LEC. He was a borderline top 2, top 3 support when he was on Astralis with Kabe in the LEC, but he was just unplayable. And the moment they put Duro in, FearX, that is last split, they got infinitely better and infinitely more scary. And again, you're just buying low on another player who kind of crashed out of the LCK. That being said, that's been a very proven success move for a lot of organizations, is buy really low on these LCK players that weren't particularly good and, revitalize them, because the LEC is a much easier kind of place to play. We've seen it with players like, obviously, Jonghoon in the first place, but Ice is probably the most noticeable, modern example of that. And so we'll see if they can, bring Execute back to glory. Still is, that aggressive hook-oriented player. Execute is definitely an apt name for him. And I think there is a lot of similarities between Patrick and Kabe in terms of the playstyles as players. And so there are some reasons to be excited potentially about this duo. I just think you're buying low on both, even if both of them are upgrades over some of the weaker players in the league from last year in Comp and Zoelise. And so, there are real issues with this team. I like Larson, and I think Adam can do stuff on this team, but Maorang was awful last year. Patrick is on the downturn. Execute is on the downturn. You have to hope that you're revitalizing them in some way. And once again, we're sitting here with Rogue in the offseason saying, okay, they bought low. They put together a team full of veterans to try to scrape by with 6th place for what? What's the point, right? There's no youth, there's no upside on this team. Best case scenario, Maorang and Execute come in and are really good, and Adam is really good, and you're looking at a team that is, borderline top 5, but, there's no room for this team to be a world's team, and you don't have any, young players that could potentially turn into superstars and sell for big profit or build around for the future. I just don't really know what the goal is when it comes to Rogue. At least for now, I'm fine with the team. I think they'll probably be, remotely competitive, but this is not even a team that I think makes top 6, and they're already so experienced. So I don't really know how to feel about it. It's not the worst team in the world, but it's certainly not the best. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC 2025 offseason roster grades video, offseason analysis, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of things to talk about. We talked about a lot, but that's every team. That's all 10 of them. We talked about their off seasons. If you want my favorite off seasons, that's kind of tricky. I think that there are a couple that stand out to me. BDS, I think, had one of my favorite off seasons of any team. I really like the additions of 113 in Paris, and Irrelevant, I think, is going to be really good on the top side. I think they're going to be a team that people underestimate, and I think they're going to do really well. Obviously, G2 just had a phenomenal off season. It's hard to say that G2 won the off season when they're starting the way that they did, but they certainly pivoted in a very positive way, so long as Skewmond is actually really good. And kind of a sleeper contender for one of the better off seasons to me was GIANTX. I don't think a lot of people are going to talk about GIANTX having as good of an off season as they did, but I think they did a great job. Again, I think the Jackies, Noah, Jun, 3-man core could be incredibly good, so long as the top side is good enough. Closer should be good enough. You're hoping you can get a lot out of lot. And so I like GIANTX's offseason, but BDS, a big winner for me. I think G2, obviously, another winner. As for losers of the offseason, I think the obvious one, at least for me, is probably Heretics, at least in terms of the question mark pings that I'm putting on them. I think retaining Flacket's great. Stend is a really good addition that I really like. I think Sheo is fine as a jungler if you can't get one of the best junglers in the league, or one of, 113 or Skewmond or whatever, right? I think Sheo is fine, but the solo laners, man, they're major question marks. I just have no clue what you're going to get out of them. And I think the other one that I'm throwing some question mark pings on is SK Gaming. I just don't think you're getting better across the board. I don't really know why you moved on from Luan. I continue to be a little bit kind of puzzled by that. Hopefully Loopy's really good, and Isma's kind of on the last straw for me. I like GenX, and I think he's undervalued, but Reeker's just kind of meh for me overall. I just don't really love the SK Gaming roster. I think if you made me think of a third, it would probably be Rogue, even with a lot of the upgrades, just because I don't think the organization of the offseason has a ton of direction for me. But those are probably the good and the bad off seasons for me. Everybody else is just kind of somewhere in the middle. But let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below. I'm really curious to hear you guys' thoughts. Obviously, I'm not always on the same page as a lot of other analysts or a lot of the popular opinion, so I'm curious to hear where you guys think I'm too high or too low on certain players or certain teams or all that. And you can expect more videos like this out very soon. The LCK video will be out in a couple of days. The LTA and the LPL videos are going to be out next week, and so I'm really excited to get those out. Sorry, it took me a second to say LTA. I had to remember what the acronym was instead of LCS, but I'm excited to continue to make these videos, and I hope you guys are excited to watch them. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all